So, okay, well, we're here to share. I'm here to share a trip that we took to England. It was about, what, 3.5 years ago now, 2017, in the fall. And we spent 2 weeks there, full 2 weeks. And we were 9 days in a car traveling around the countryside, various places. And then we were 3 days in London at the end. So, and we flew in and out of London. So just a little geography lesson to get going. You can see where London is in south east England. And that's where we flew in and out. And then we immediately headed about an hour south, close to Brighton. It was just east of Brighton. And that's essentially the chalk cliffs that go all the way to Dover. It's not just in Dover where you see them, and that was part of the reason we wanted to go there. From there, we just had an overnight, and we traveled to Salisbury, which is quite historic. You'll see that, very close to Stonehenge. And then up to Avebury, which also had a stone circle. Over to Bath, which is getting on the closer to Wales, really. And Bath is the southernmost place where the Cotswolds are. The Cotswolds are kind of a skinny, you know, crooked area, I guess, west of London, with a lot of charming homes and things like that. And it runs 100 miles all the way from Bath up to, well, you can see close to Warwick and in there. That's a little bit north of it, but that's the whole section that they call the Cotswolds. Made a side trip to Oxford, and then we drove up to Warwickshire, is the next area, which you'll see pictures of, and that's Stratford on Avon, where Shakespeare was born. And then up to Liverpool. What was that?
Just wanted to interrupt you a second. I see you, I don't see your computer.
Uh-oh. Well, I'm glad you told me.
Yes, we don't either, actually. So
hold on. Let me go back. Let me start over again. Sorry about that. I'm blabbing on.
It's okay. We've been oh, there we go.
Okay.
Here it is.
Let's try again. All right, is that better?
Yep.
Okay, you can see it. You can see it full screen, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you heard a little of my intro. We went to England for 2 weeks, 9 days in the countryside, 3 days in London, flew in and out of London. Okay, so here's the map that I was talking about. We flew into London, went directly south by car to a place called Seaford, which is about an hour away. And that's the kind of chalk cliff area right on the English Channel. Then we spent a night there, went on to Salisbury, which is very historic and is very close to Stonehenge. Spent 2 nights there and also went to another stone circle called Avebury, which you'll see pictures of. And then we spent 3 nights in Bath, which is the southernmost part of about 100-mile stretch where that crooked line is. That goes northeast and northwest or southwest, which is the Cotswolds. And we spent quite a good deal of time in Bath and in the Cotswolds, because that's kind of where all the really charming homes and gardens are. From there, we went up to Liverpool, and then we took a fast train back to London, where we spent another 3 days. Okay, so Seaford was our first overnight, really, just out of London. And as you can see, all along this coast, there are these beautiful chalk cliffs. You think of Dover as having the chalk cliffs, but they're all along there. And they're quite dramatic, and they're actually quite dangerous. They break away, and, you know, I hate to say it, but some people do choose to take their lives off these things. but they're huge. And our first day there, it was beautifully clear, and we're on the beach, and we're saying, okay, tomorrow's going to be great for a walk along these. And then the weather changed. So, but this was our initial view. And all along Seaford, and also really all over England, it's something that's quite different than here. They have these ways, they're called the Cotswold Way. This was the South Downs Way. And it's essentially just they're paths that were quite old. And rather than, it was always traditional that farmers could move their crops, or people could walk from one place to another, and that's maintained today. So these are really public lands. Anybody can walk on them. It's not like some farmer's going to come out with a shotgun and say you're on his land. So it's really, it's delightful to have a country that's so open like that. And you know, they even have they call them stiles to facilitate you getting over some of the fences if you have to cross. So here our biggest obstacle was there were a lot of rabbits, so they had a lot of holes, and we had to watch out for them. But this was a view from the top, and as you can see, this is really, you have to be careful. They don't want you to go too close to the edge, because sometimes this does break away. They just had a huge one. I think it was about a year ago, and I saw some video on it. So it's quite dramatic, but it's stunningly beautiful too. And you can just walk along here and enjoy the scenery. Now this was the best view I got of the chalk cliffs along here. There was an area called the Seven Sisters, and there were 7 of these cliffs that kind of rose and fell. And it was such a foggy day that this is what we got. So unfortunately, you take the weather that you get when you're there, but it was very nice to explore this area. The next day we went to Salisbury, which is a very ancient medieval town. There are a number of things it's known for. I think it dates to probably the 1200s. And the Salisbury Cathedral is certainly one of the main attractions. It's hard to see it here, but this is 400 feet high. In fact, if you look at the little to the right, kind of at the bottom, there's a person standing there, and that gives you a better sense of scale, a little person in a blue shirt. This is really a huge, huge cathedral. And it has in it one of the 4 remaining copies of the Magna Carta, which is in its own room, which we went and visited. You can't take pictures. But this was an absolutely stunning cathedral right in the middle of town. And as you drive into town, it dominates the landscape. You know, you kind of come down maybe around a corner or something, and you see this valley open up, and there's that huge cathedral right in the middle of it. This is part of inside, the main part, and it needs a little bit of explanation. This is the nave. This is part of the long part. And in the middle of it, they had this really amazing fountain. This is like one of those infinity pools or fountains that you see that's just still and then flows over the edge. So it had beautiful reflections of the cathedral ceiling. And then they had these, this was a permanent installation, this glass mobile, which was also reflected in it. But they had they had a whole bunch of glass displays in there, which were really beautiful. But this one was probably the most stunning because of the way it was suspended over this pool. This is another picture of the nave. And as you can see, it's huge. You can see the pipe organ on the right, just absolutely beautiful. This was well worth a stop, and it's just a stunning place. And off to the left, that particular ceiling detail was in a little round room where they did have the Magna Carta. So that was the closest I was going to get to taking a picture of it. The Magna Carta is actually, there were 40 copies made. They were all handwritten and distributed among cathedrals. And as I said, only 4 remain. And it was very interesting to see it. You could kind of peer at it, and it was the writing was it was so straight, and you could actually see very faint lines I used, you know, to make it straight, you know, to guide the writing. But it was something to see. And on the right is a picture of just a medieval gate in the town, because the town itself is also very historic. And you know, you're just walking along and you might see a KFC, and then you see this, and it's a beautiful town. You may have heard of Salisbury in the news maybe 2 or 3 years ago. There was a bit of a scandal that there was a and you know, it didn't seem like a likely place for this to happen, where I think some Russians poisoned somebody, or multiple people, and it had to do with espionage. I can't remember the details, but that was right here in Salisbury, not when we were there. These are more pictures from Salisbury, and as you can see, it's very well preserved, and you know, it kind of meanders about. You know, the roads aren't too straight necessarily, and you just come across this beautiful architecture. The new inn actually dated to, I think it was around, they called it the new inn because it was newer probably than an old inn, but I believe that dated to probably about the 1400s originally. And of course they've updated it and kept it preserved since. We had lunch there, and there was a beautiful garden view of the spire of the cathedral at the back. So our next stop the next day was Stonehenge, which was about 20 minutes north of Salisbury. You have to go to Stonehenge, and it's actually a fairly easy day trip from London. It would take you the better part of a day to take a bus and to go out there for a tour, but you certainly can do it. We drove there, and you know, it's because it's such a big tourist attraction. You're on a timed bus, so you arrive at a certain time, they take you back there, they let you walk around, then you get on the next bus back. And it's really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's not a lot around it, but it's interesting because you can see sort of like those, I don't know, they look like little ditches almost. Well, those are actually other parts of older stone circles that they've been able to identify by like X-ray, or you know, ways of, without digging it up. And of course, what's amazing about Stonehenge, I'll show you another picture, are the stones themselves, because they kind of are of two types. You can see kind of the ones that are lumpier to the left. Those are called Cirencesters, and they know where they come from. They come from a place about 30 minutes north of there called Avebury. But the taller, skinny one with the little thing on the top, the smoother one, that's actually bluestone, and that comes from Wales, which is 250 miles away. So Stonehenge is a place where the more you learn about it, the less you know about who these people were. They know it dates about 4,000 years, and probably some older, because it's built on older ruins. They know where the stones came from. They know that it has significant astronomical features, which are always celebrated every year. And beyond that, they're not sure what they used it for. So there's a lot of questions about it, and you just kind of ponder it when you're there, I guess. So I mentioned Avebury was one place where some of the stones came from. And Avebury is about 30 minutes north of Stonehenge. And people don't always go there, but Avebury has a stone circle, you know, not as well formed. It doesn't have the tops that connect the circle, but the circle is much larger. Stonehenge was relatively small. I mean, I don't know, maybe 40 feet across, I'm guessing. But Avebury is a mile across. So what happened here was the stones were all buried, and they suspect that perhaps during, that perhaps the stones were seen as pagan symbols, and they were buried by Christian groups who knows when, but they were buried. And there's in the center of Avebury, there's actually a town and a manor and at least one restaurant. So it's sort of like you're sitting in the middle of a stone circle. And Avebury, these are very, very big stones. And when the stones were all buried, well, nobody really knew they were there. But then there was a man who bought the manor, the Avebury Manor, and he was kind of a very good amateur archaeologist. And he discovered these and started to put them back in their sockets, so to speak. And he got about maybe halfway done. And then World War II happened and everybody ran out of money. So the circle is halfway restored. So it's interesting. There's sheep in the middle of this, and you know, it's just kind of in the middle of normal life in England. This is a picture of Avebury Manor. You know, the British are known for their gardens, and they are stunning. And we were there late in the year. We were there in September. So, you know, these are fall flowers, but they just keep them beautifully, and they have beautiful walls. And if you like gardens, you know, England is a beautiful place to go. So this is where the amateur architect or amateur archaeologist lived while he was restoring these stones. And this gives you a little perspective about how big they are. That's my husband, Vern. I said, stand there so people will know, because otherwise you can't really tell how big they are. There were two of these stones that were so close to the road that they did move them to a different location, because people were so startled at seeing these huge stones so close to the road that they tended to drive off the road. So they didn't want to create that kind of a problem. And then again, very close, it's actually in Avebury. You're just going down a country road and you see this hill, and it's called Silbury Hill. And they know how old it is. They know it goes to Neolithic times, 4,000 years approximately. But again, they don't know what it was used for. There are no burial. There was no evidence that it was used for burial. And they really just don't know what they use this for, but it's very distinctive on the landscape because it definitely looks like man-made. And I don't have a picture of this, but where I'm taking the picture from is up on a nearby hill where there was, they call it a barrow, and a barrow is a burial site where they found evidence of about 5 different families. So these two are very close together, and very interesting because they're just so odd, especially the hill. Then I mentioned we moved on to Bath, which was definitely one of my favorite places in all of England. It's a relatively small city. I don't know the population. It sits in kind of a valley, but there's a river that crosses the canal there, which makes it very scenic for the 2 reasons, two bodies of water. And they have a beautiful old abbey and Roman baths, which I'll show you pictures of, which were just amazing. You could spend a whole day just at the Roman bath. So, but this is the ceiling, which is quite distinctive in this abbey in Bath. And it's very close to it's like kitty corner from where the Roman bath is. It's a very cosmopolitan city too. You know, a lot of upscale shops, and Bath was just gorgeous. So that's the Abbey in the background, that you can see that taller building. But what you see in the foreground is the Roman bath. And, you know, when the Romans came into England, at Bath, they found a natural thermal spring. So they built this entire complex where they bathed, which was a very social and in many ways political activity. You know, people would kind of stop by 5 o'clock and they would make deals and they'd socialize, and it was a very integrated part of their life. And the whole thing was covered up. The whole thing was, you know, underground. It was gone. And in the late 1800s, there was a man who was poking through a wall in his basement and he uncovered a piece of it. You know, this entire complex was just underground, and they have been excavating it since. They're still excavating it, and it's just amazing. It had about, I think there were 4 levels. Like right now, you'd be at the top level, okay? And it still worked. The water was still there. The lead pipes, unfortunately, they did use lead, still had the water. They had rooms where they were like steam baths, and they had tiles underneath where literally slaves would go down there and pour water on the tiles so the steam would come up for people, and then they'd scrape them down before their bath. And this used to be covered, so the water would not be green, but now it's not. So, you know, the water's going to be green. And there was quite there was a lot of mythology involved with this too, of water gods and goddesses that they worshipped. So the whole thing is a museum. You know, part of it is looking at the original structures, but then there's actually museums that hold artifacts that they found here. So this is just a fascinating place. I've never seen anything like it. So these are a couple things from the museum. On the right is, you know, a depiction of, I'm not going to be able to tell you which one it is, but one of the goddesses associated with water that they worshipped. They had a whole temple there too for various deities. And then this thing to the left is actually pretty small. It's only maybe 3 inches square, okay? And it's flat, and it's a piece of tin. And what they would do is they would write curses on them and throw them in the water, one particular part of the baths. And it was basically a prayer that something bad would happen to somebody. So these were kind of entertaining, actually, and they you know, had write-ups about what these curses were. And the most common one was like stealing of clothing, because, you know, people were in bathing suits or whatever they wore. So there were all these curses, evidently, that people threw in the water when people stole their clothing and did other things, I'm assuming. In Bath, at one time, during the time of King George, there was an architectural style called Crescents that developed, and you see these all over England, but the one in Bath is huge. If you look at the size of the cars, I couldn't even get all of it in one shot. It just didn't fit. So, but this is a good example of that. Sometimes they were round, they were totally round, broken up by streets. And Bath was also, at one time, was the place to go if you wanted to get noticed by anybody who was anybody in royalty. So it seemed that, you know, women, if they wanted to get noticed, they could go to Bath, and these could be ordinary women, and hopefully catch the eye of some young man of royalty through their singing, their playing of instruments, their social skills, their beauty, their dancing. Men likewise had opportunities here as well, but the thing that was most valuable for men was to be able to dance. So, you know, when you see those old style costumes where they're showing their calves, well, there's a reason they're showing their calves, because dancing was such an important part of their social life. This is another view of Bath. You can tell I liked it because I took a bunch of pictures. This is a very old bridge, and they have an artificial waterfall here. You can actually take boats out there, but I think there's it looks like there's a passage, I think, where you can bypass the waterfall. But, you know, you're just walking along and seeing these beautiful old structures. As I mentioned, Bath has both the Avon River, which also goes through Stratford on Avon. The Avon River goes all the way, it meanders up the west side of England. And then they had a canal system, and their canal system was built close to the same time as the Erie Canal. It's much narrower there. It's a much narrower structure though, and their canal boats are probably only 8 feet wide, maybe. They're little skinny things, but people do live on them. They live on them as houseboats. And then, of course, they've done the same thing that we did here. They changed the mule paths into recreational paths. So people ride bikes, they walk, they jog, and that sort of thing. And there was one picture I wish I had taken, but I didn't have the courage to ask the people if I could. There was one of those boats just parked alongside, and it was about 4 o'clock, and they had taken out of there. They were a little scrungy looking, you know. Some of the people, I think, they come out and they put tents up, and they might sleep on those instead of sleeping on the boat. But they look, you know, they looked a little bit like hippies, to be honest. And but they had taken a coffee table, and they had it all set with a gold-colored tea set. And there they were having their tea, you know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Got to do it. This is a view from up high in Bath, because Bath is kind of in a valley. We stayed kind of in the area to the left of the picture at the bottom there. But this is taken from, well, it's called Salisbury Hill, which, if any of you are Peter Gabriel fans, he wrote a song about Salisbury Hill. It's actually a very old Iron Age site. There used to be an Iron Age village up there. Right now there's just cows and a lot of wind and a beautiful view. So we went up there because actually the song talks about climbing up on Salisbury Hill. So we did that, and my husband actually played music, and it was kind of corny, but it was fun. But it did have a gorgeous view. And Peter Gabriel, if anyone wants to know, he lives very close to Bath and has his recording studio there nearby, in a place called Box, of all things, as in a packing box. So I mentioned Bath was the beginning of the Cotswolds. And here, the Cotswolds are just a series of very small towns and just the most beautiful little villages you can imagine. You know, thatched roofs, lots of flowers. For a lot of people, this is their favorite part of England, and I think it was probably my favorite part too. It was hard to choose, but it ranked up there. This is a place called Cirencester. And in this town, although I don't show pictures of it, there are both Roman and Norman ruins that you can visit, including a Roman amphitheater, which is just kind of a hole in the ground. It's not too formal. Here's another little town called Tetbury. And as you can see, they just love their flowers, and their flowers are everywhere. It's just so nice. That's all I can say. You can just spend a lot of time walking around and being charmed. This is a cream tea, and some people argue that the Cotswolds makes the best cream teas. And they have cream teas, and then they have high teas. And a high tea is really it's like a 3-tiered meal. It has 3 plates, and you'll have finger sandwiches and things like that. And depending on how fancy it is, you can really make a meal of it. A cream tea is a simpler tea that will probably it'll ruin your appetite too, to be honest. But I gotta say, I got used to a lot of these. These are scones, and they were absolutely delicious, but they're not like the little wedge type scones that we tend to see here at all. They're a little bit more like a popover, but denser than a popover. And then, you know, they always serve it with a fresh jam of some sort. And then that's clotted cream behind there, which is more like butter than whipped cream. It's not really sweet, but it is rich. And we asked how they made clotted cream, and it was some kind of complicated process about using whole milk and boiling it slowly or warming it up slowly so that the cream would come to the top, and then they skim that off, and that's the clotted cream. So it was all very interesting. I gotta say, it was very addicting. This was absolutely delicious food. Another place we went in the Cotswolds at the suggestion of our Airbnb hosts was Painswick. And Painswick has this old church and old cemetery, and then these yew trees. You can kind of see them in the background. If you look near the bottom of the church, you see two people standing there, so you get an idea how big these yew trees are. But they're at least 100 years old, and they're trimmed into these really tight shapes. I'd never seen anything quite like that, but a lot to maintain, I thought, in a place like this. And when we, after we returned from a day in the Cotswolds, we mentioned we'd been to Painswick to our hosts, and they said, "Oh, Painswick." And evidently, little did we know, this is the site of like a very famous and very well attended body painting event in the spring. So I looked it up later, and yeah, there's people, and they've spray painted their bodies, and quite elaborate. So, you know, who would think in Painswick? It's a very small town. Here's a doorway in Painswick that just I thought was interesting and typical. It looks a little beat up. And then to the right, we found this little French restaurant in Painswick, and that was our table, you know, and it was just perfect. It was just the right size, a beautiful view, you know, the stone building that it was in, and, you know, it just made for a lovely visit, a lovely day. And outside of Painswick, I mentioned that ways in England are really paths that you can walk, the public can walk without any problems really, except you might run into sheep once in a while. But this was a shot that I took. We walked the Cotswolds way, which that way meanders about 100 miles from Bath up to, oh, I can't remember. It's got some cute little name in the north. And our host gave us a book and said, well, try to get for a little walk on the Cotswolds way. So this was it's just going through a field, you know, and it was just charming. It was just, you know, it was a really nice way to spend a part of an afternoon. So here's Vern. I mentioned the stiles, and this is, you know, it's very polite. They put in these little ways for you to get over a fence, so you don't have to climb the fence as you're walking on the way. And the little, you can see a little insignia or something on that post, and that actually kind of, that's your guide that you're in the right place. So, you know, that you're still on the Cotswold way, and you know, you kind of look for these breaks in the fences as you go through fields. To the right is the Red Lion, which the first time we went to Red Lion, we thought it was such a unique and cute name, except it turns out it's about the most common name for a restaurant or a pub in England. So it became less impressive. But part of our trip, my husband had done a lot of research on his side of the family, genealogical. And so we stopped in some small places just because he had family that came from there. And one of them was Hunningham, and that's the Red Lion in Hunningham. I mean, Hunningham was so small, they had a sign, a curve in the road, and a Red Lion, and maybe a bridge. You know, there wasn't a gas station, there wasn't a hotel, there was nothing to really find, you know, the name Hunningham on. So we took a picture of the Red Lion. Another place we went in the Cotswolds is called Lacock, and they did do some filming of the Harry Potter series here, actually all over England, but this was definitely one place. And Lacock has an abbey, which you see to the left, and then the manor house is to the right. And another thing that was really wonderful to see in Lacock, well, I'm a photographer, so I enjoyed this, but there's a photography, let me back up. The man who lived in the Lacock manor was named, at one time was named Fox Talbot. And Fox Talbot was a very early developer of photography in the mid 1800s. And you've probably heard of Daguerreotypes. Well, Daguerreotype, or the man, it was named after Daguerre, or however you would pronounce his name. Both he and Fox Talbot were both competitors, but not after the same thing. I think Degar, or the Doggerite side, who is French, obviously, that's why I'm massacring his name, was involved with photographic process. In other words, trying to make a photograph. And Fox Talbot was involved with duplicating photographs. So there was really a wonderful museum in there. They had plenty of Kodak cameras, and it took you basically from the very early days of photography in the 1800s to present day. And they had quite an impressive digital display there as well. So that was kind of a surprise. We didn't even really know that that was there, and we stumbled upon it. These are more pictures of the Cotswolds, just kind of random shots. The picture on the right is just a little, it's actually a ruin. I mean, it's all filled with like junk when we peeked in the windows. But we were on the search again for a genealogical thing, and this was next to a church, and there wasn't anything to identify what it was. It was just there, and that's kind of what you see a lot in the Cotswolds. Another cute little town. They have very cute names in the Cotswolds too. This is called Stow-on-Wold. And here are good examples actually of what's called, am I going to get it right? It's a particular kind of Cotswold stone that is used in all their buildings. And it's this yellow stone. It's quite characteristic of the Cotswolds. So you see it everywhere. Here's Yatton Canal, which again is very small. They had pretty much a church and a churchyard, a place where, well, it acted as like, you know, a very small grocery store and a gas station and a post office. And other than that, it was mostly houses. And we went here because it was actually kind of on our way. And we had a friend who said, well, I have relatives there, so go there and take pictures of Yatton Canal. So we did. On the left, you can see, I kind of like that picture on the left because it shows this really old house and then this very modern car. But you can see a sign to Castle Combe, which was not far from here. And that's one of the more popular places to go. And we literally could not find a place to park. But we kind of saw all the beautiful geraniums and the window boxes and all things, you know, but it was a very popular place to go. Cherington is another area in the Cotswold. Again, people might not go here, but we did have an Underhill connection here. So we found this place. It was raining and raining steadily all day. And we found this church that we kind of knew about on the right. And it turns out they actually were open on a Saturday because they had, I guess they were having a road race, like a running race. And that was a stop. So we got to talk to, you know, the man who was kind of opening it for the race. And then my husband knew about this window in this church, and this church dates, I think, to the 1500s. And that's the window to the left, and you can kind of see on the bottom it does say Underhill, and the Underhill crest is a deer or a hart. So this is the joining of two families. I can't quite read the other one, but we were delighted to be able to find the window that we knew was there. And on our rainy day, one of the things we did was we drove to Oxford, which could have been a really nice trip if it hadn't been so rainy. We didn't spend too much time here. The structure to the left is actually it's a monument to Protestant martyrs who were actually killed here during the Reformation times. And then on the right is the Ashmolean Museum, which is really a world-class museum. I hadn't heard of it until I started doing this research. And we kind of did a quick greatest hits tour of what's in there. You know, they kind of have, well, if you only have time for 10 things, these are the things to see. But that was a very impressive museum. It was just very interesting, all kinds of things with natural history. And they actually had in there, this was a mantle or a big cloak from Pocahontas's father, I believe it was. And, you know, just interesting things that you wouldn't expect. So we made a quick stop in there. You can tour Oxford, you know, the actual college. We didn't have time to do it, but, you know, because they're kind of enclosed. there's walls sort of enclosing them, or they're connected, so you have to go in these entrances. Warwickshire is not technically in the Cotswolds, but it's very close, and it's actually in the area where Shakespeare had his original childhood home. So, and again, we went to Warwickshire. This was part of our genealogical tour, to go to Ettington Manor. And Ettington Manor is this gorgeous place. Now it's a hotel, and a very nice hotel. But for many years, it was a manor house with huge grounds. And Ettington in the 1500s was rented for 100 years by the Underhill family from the Shirley family. So we actually, it was kind of funny when we walked in, we had contacted them and asked them for any information they had about Underhill history information that they sent us. But when we walked in and we told them who we were, they said, "Oh, well, welcome home." So that was very special. And Ettington, again, is a really good example of that Cotswold stone, that yellow stone that's just all over the place. And this was just a beautiful, we just spent one night here, but it was amazing. It's hard to get a sense of size for that tree, but the trees at Ettington were absolutely huge. And supposedly it was haunted. They said it was one of the more haunted places in England, which made me sleep not so well. But this to the right, you could kind of believe it would be haunted to look at that structure. But that dates, I believe, to the 1100s, and we were able to find it's a ruin. So there's not much to it. It's mostly that tower, and then it's just kind of open. But at the base of that tower, on what would be the inside, what had been the inside, we were able to find my husband's 11th great-grandmother's gravestone. And the Underhills have a genealogical society here, and they have a plaque mounted on the inside of that particular tower. So I think my husband got up about 6 times in the night just to look at that tower at night. So, and these are more pictures. On the right, again, there's that tower in the day, and it connects with a well-maintained chapel that was built by the Shirley family, who owned Ettington for many years. And then that was our room on the left, which was just wonderful, and it looked right out on that spooky-looking tower. And when we got there, of course, we had tea. We didn't have high tea, but we had the regular tea. And I think these people, if you can see what on the left, kind of they had the 3-tiered things. That's a high tea. But they just invite you into this beautiful room, you know, to enjoy yourself. And they played croquet on the field. And, you know, it was our splurge. It was our one night when we said, no holds barred here. We're just going to enjoy, you know, Ettington. Not far from Ettington is a place called Kenilworth Castle, and Kenilworth is quite historic. It was started in the Norman times, so the tower that you see to the right with hardly any windows in it, that's a Norman tower. So we're talking about 1200, and then they kept adding to it right through the 1600s. And then in the 1600s, there was actually a little mini revolution in England, although they went back to having a monarchy. But while that was going on, a lot of historic places suffered a lot of damage, and Kenilworth is one of them. But Kenilworth was most known, if you've ever, I don't know, I didn't know all this history, but there was a man named Robert Dudley in the 1500s who Queen Elizabeth I had her eye on, and he was her favorite, as they said, and he was trying to impress her. So she had given him Kenilworth, and he invited her up there and did all these preparations and had a 2-week visit up there where Queen Elizabeth came to visit, and she didn't decide to marry him, although you gotta wonder why, with all the impressive stuff he probably did at that time and the gardens and all that. And we were fortunate, again, the Underhills have a connection here because Robert Dudley hired some Underhills, and one of them, there were several people that he hired. mostly to take care of the draperies and the tapestries, seemed to be what they did. So that's our connection there. And Kenilworth is, again, it's easily a half-day visit. It's a very impressive place. Used to be surrounded by a moat that was man-made. It's not anymore. And it was just an incredible place, really. On the left here, you can see some of the restored Elizabethan gardens. I don't think they're fully restored, but they are very beautiful there. And then some of the ruins. As you walk through, they tell you, you know, like, well, this was the kitchen and this was that and all that. But it goes on and on. It's really quite extensive. Another view of Kenilworth. And, you know, imagine this all being surrounded by a moat, because it was, and a huge man-made lake that was eventually drained. And then Stratford is really Stratford upon Avon, but this is the home of Shakespeare, which is again in Warwickshire. This is all relatively close. And Shakespeare, he had his childhood home here, and he also, Anne Hathaway, which was his wife, has a home here. We didn't have a chance to visit her place, but her place was one of those beautiful thatched roof homes. I wish we'd had the time to do it, but you know, Stratford is not a really small town, and it's got all this beautiful architecture in it from, I don't know, the 1500s probably. And there was another reason, genealogical reason to go here, because the Underhills actually sold the land to Shakespeare where he had his original home, which is no longer, but they do have a place called the New Garden, and it's just a garden that you can go into behind kind of a screened wall. We didn't go in there, but that's where the house was. So right across from where this New Garden was a place called the Harvard House, and they happened to have, we were there on a day when they had free entrance. So we said, well, let's go to the Harvard House, whatever that is. Well, it turns out that this actually is owned by Harvard and maintained by it. It's a very old building, again, dating probably to the 1500s. And it had a very interesting story. I'm not going to relate the whole thing, but basically a butcher who was very successful in the 1500s owned this house. And then he came over to the United States, became involved in the founding of Harvard or some of the financing of it. Maybe I've got my years wrong. And eventually Harvard owned this house. So it's you can look it up if you're really interested in the history behind this, but I had no idea it was even there. Another place we went was Bushbury. Again, this is an Underhill connection. His family lived there for a long time. And right now it's kind of it's like a petting zoo type farm is what they do, but it was called Northy Coat Farm. So we visited there, looked around. There was a place called Underhill Lane, I think it was, and took pictures. And then from there we took just a day trip up to Liverpool. Well, it took us a day to get to Liverpool from there, which is on the Mersey River, but that's getting further north in England, and the furthest north we got. Along the way, we saw this gigantic rabbit in a field, and we're like, what is that? And it turns out it was Beatrix Potter's 150th birthday. So this ice cream place had put together, these are like hay, the brown part is hay, and then the blue jacket is made from blue plastic bags. And it was just so impressive, we had to stop and take pictures of this and have an ice cream cone. So. And Liverpool, as I said, it's on the Mersey River. You might have heard, what's it called? Oh, there's a famous song about the Mersey River. You would know it if you heard it. That we heard 1,000 times when we were there. But Liverpool is, of course, the home of the Beatles and the home of a lot of musicians that come out of England. It's interesting because in the South, when we were along the coast and stuff, the southern coast, there was a lot of talk when we said we were going to Liverpool about, oh, well, that's an industrial town. That's kind of bad looking or dirty or whatever. And we didn't find that at all. It actually it had a beautifully restored, I'm assuming restored waterfront, a very walkable commercial area with beautiful shops and places to eat in the city itself. We were only there for a day, but of course we had to enjoy some of the Beatles stuff because there's Beatles stuff all over. But and this is not a beetle to the left. This was some guy I never heard of, but it was right on the waterfront, and it was kind of a cool statue, so I took a picture. And then they have, you know, just like we had horses around here, they have Liverpool lambs all over the place that they decorated. So here's a obviously a statue of the Fab Four that I was having fun with. And we did a tour bus that took us around. It was called the Magical Mystery Tour, that took us around to famous places and their songs. One was Strawberry Field, which you can see is full of graffiti. It's not nearly as nice actually as the Strawberry Field Monument or the circle that you see in New York City. But this was a girls' school, and I guess John kind of hung out there and tried to get the attention of the girls. So that's partly what that song is about. And we stopped by the church where Eleanor Rigby is buried, and supposedly John and Paul met there in church. And then the cavern is still, I want to say it's still there. It's not really still there. They tore the original cavern where so many bands played in Liverpool. They tore that down for a subway project. Then they didn't do the subway project, so they saved all the bricks and they rebuilt it like right next door. So it's a recreated cavern, but using original bricks. So then we took a fast train down to London on a rainy day, as it turned out, and stayed 3 days here. And our first day, we took a long walk through a bunch of parks from Notting Hill, where we were staying, and then we took a boat ride on the Thames all the way to Greenwich. Greenwich, it's actually a good-sized town or small city to the east of London. So it took probably an hour to get out there and an hour back, and it was narrated, very interesting. But this was actually our path. You know, we went through Hyde Park and we went through Kensington Gardens and St. James Park, which is a charming little park, and ended up on the Thames. The picture to the upper right is actually in Kensington Gardens. They have these, believe it or not, temporary outside art displays, and this was one that was quite impressive. It was just all these squares, but it changed as you moved around it. And then we didn't really know. We kind of were meandering. We knew where we had to go, but we didn't have much of a plan. And we ended up at Buckingham Palace, which is down below, at about 11:30. And we're approaching it, and we're hearing bagpipes. And we're going, oh, well, what's that? Well, it turns out it was a changing of the guard, which we didn't know that we were going to stumble upon. So there were hundreds and hundreds of people. They had to close down various roads. And it's not just a few people walking in and replacing a few guards. It's like, you know, regiments. It's sort of like, it's hard to describe it. They do this every day. And they all play music, and, you know, it's all around there, this event that they do. So we were lucky we couldn't get close to it, but we were lucky to be there when it happened. To the left, this is really a typical London scene. You see printed there, look right, and they're deadly serious about that, because you can be hit by bicycles and scooters and motorcycles just as easily as those gigantic buses. And it was really kind of them to do that, because I think even Londoners need to be very careful of the traffic here. And then Big Ben, of course. So it was under renovation. It wasn't chiming at the time. And then here are some shots of some of the parks that we passed through. There were pelicans in Hyde Park. Hyde Park is the one to the right, and you can see it doesn't look this way, but that's the Eye, the famous Ferris wheel that they built during the Olympics. And that's on the other side of the Thames, you know, so there's a park in between there and a building, and then finally you get to the Eye. It's a little deceiving. And then this gigantic entrance to Hyde Park monument was impressive. There's a lot that was impressive. So I mentioned we went out to Greenwich, and Greenwich is known for a few things, but one of them is for Greenwich Mean Time, which sets a time really for the entire world. And there was an extensive, a number of places you could visit. There was an observatory up there with a big rotating telescope. And then to the right, you can see the clock that actually keeps Greenwich Mean Time. So it's very precise time there. And there actually was I think it was on the top of the observatory. No, I can't remember. But a red ball that would come down at 1 o'clock every day to set Greenwich Mean Time. So people would watch, you know, like from the Thames or from wherever they were, to be able to accurately set your time. So that was kind of interesting. The shot below shows currently it's a naval academy, but this used to be the site of the Royal Palace in Queen Elizabeth I's time, but totally different buildings. It didn't look like this. So they allowed them to excavate and to find the original footings of the palace and to take pictures and to document what was there and put it in a museum, which you can visit here, and then cover it all back up. So they do have like a kind of a plaque on the ground there that shows where it was, but you wouldn't know that, but that was the Royal Palace at one time. And this is a closer view of the Eye on the Thames, and you know, late in the day. We didn't go on that, but it takes, those are huge cars that are on the places where you sit. And it takes, you go around once and it takes an hour. So it's a really big Ferris wheel. And then of course it was getting to be on sunset, and everyone was waiting, you know, for the sun to perfectly set by Big Ben. So I took a couple shots here with a bunch of other photographers who were waiting for just the right moment. This is a Westminster Bridge, which again, it's a little depressing, but where they had some terrorism recently in London, maybe a couple of years ago, there was an incident on this bridge. So, but it's beautiful. And that's on the far side, to the left of Big Ben, is Parliament, which was under renovation as well. So on our second day there, I think it was, we went to the Tower of London, which that's the Tower Bridge. A lot of people say that's London Bridge, but it's actually the Tower Bridge. And here's a Tower Guard, you know, the very famous ones, very stoic, probably very hot on the day that we were there. And underneath the Tower Bridge there, you can see the Shard. They have some amazing architectural structures all along the Thames. It's a really nice trip because you get to see a lot of them and they talk about them. And that's a very, very tall building. So in the Tower of London has a long and storied past, and the original part of it is actually this building to the right called the White Tower. And, you know, it's essentially an armory, and they also keep the royal, the crown jewels there, which you can't take any pictures of. And it's not just jewels, it's also things like beautiful silver and gold platters and dinnerware and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of amazing what's in that museum. But they do have a lot of old armor there, including, you know, full outfits for horses and all that. So, and this is where you see the Beefeaters. I don't have any pictures of them, but the men in, well, they're on the Beefeaters bottle of, is it vodka or something? And so it's a very traditional place, and it's very, you learn a lot about history. They say it has a bloody past, but actually it's a lot more interesting than that. They actually had a zoo here for many years because, you know, they didn't have zoos. So people would come here to see the zoo animals until they did have zoos. So it's kind of a little known thing about it. But there were various beheadings here, and you know, it was a jail. And yeah, lots of famous people ended up here, unfortunately. So that's another picture of it from the Thames. Okay, you can see there's the White Tower right in the middle of it. But it's definitely worth spending a better part of a day here or a half day here because it's so extensive. And then on the right is one of the famous tower ravens. And these ravens evidently have been staying here for a long time. They treat them pretty well. And rumor has it that if the ravens leave the tower, then, you know, England will fall. So I think that's why they treat them well. Their wings are not clipped, so they could leave, but I think they make them pretty comfortable and feed them well. There's actually a book that I heard about. I heard a podcast about, I think it was called The Raven Master or something like that. And it was about the guy who keeps the ravens at the Tower of London. And he said they used to actually clip their wings to keep them there, to force them so they couldn't leave. But they stopped that practice because sometimes they would fly up high, and in one case, one of them just fell to his death because he couldn't fly. So they stopped doing that. And, you know, his job is to keep them happy and to make sure that they come home at night, you know, to kind of find them and make sure they find their way home. But they're very loud, and they're, I don't know how many of them there are, probably a dozen or something. They just hang around. They're very friendly. This is Westminster Abbey, a place that you can't take any pictures of inside. So my pictures are pretty much outside. This is where a lot of people, you know, this is where coronations take place. It's where a lot of famous people are buried, going right back to, I think Queen Elizabeth I is in there, and Churchill, and just, you know, you walk along and some of them are on the floor, there's stones, and other ones have crypts, sort of like on the sides. It's a very popular place, and I think the reason they don't let you take pictures is because if people took selfies in there, people would never get out of there because it's so busy and so crowded. So I suspect that's part of the reason. And then we did some kind of touristy things while we were there. To the left, you might recognize that, except not with that guy, my husband, but that's Abbey Road. And that's the famous, you know, the Beatles album where they're crossing that crosswalk. And, you know, everybody was doing this. Everybody was walking across and taking pictures. And Abbey Road is relatively small, but they do have a gift shop there where you can buy various paraphernalia and stuff. And then that's me. And that was kind of a waste of time going to that particular place. It was the Sherlock Holmes Museum, but you know, Sherlock Holmes wasn't a real guy, so it was all kind of recreated. But we had a fun time there. I mean, it was okay, but I wouldn't recommend it. I got to wear the guy's hat. Okay, so these last two, I mentioned about the full gear for the horses in the tower, and that's a picture of the hundreds of pounds that they would carry around to defend themselves, and then a picture of the eye as well. So, okay, well, I'm gonna stop recording and and you guys can take yourselves off mute if you want, and we can have a discussion.
This conference will now be recorded.
No.